Chosen one. There comes a moment in your journey when the people who once tried to control, provoke, or weaken you suddenly realize something has changed. It is not always announced. It is rarely dramatic. In fact, the moment often happens quietly in a conversation, a situation, or a conflict that used to shake you, but now passes without moving you at all. The same tactic appears, the same sarcasm, the same pressure, the same attempt to provoke an emotional reaction. But this time, nothing happens. You remain calm. You remain grounded. You respond without anger, or you simply decline to engage at all. In that moment, the person attempting to move you feels something they did not expect. They realize they no longer have influence over your emotional state. This is the turning point, when an enemy begins understanding that you are untouchable. Being untouchable does not mean arrogance, superiority, or pretending to be invincible. It does not mean you never face conflict, or that you walk through life without opposition. Untouchable simply means you have reached a level of internal stability where manipulation no longer works. You are grounded in your discipline, your boundaries, and your emotional regulation. The tactics that once controlled the dynamic between you and others no longer produce the same result. You do not react the way you once did. You do not chase explanations from people who distort the truth. You do not give access to individuals who repeatedly misuse it. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of defending yourself endlessly, you enforce boundaries. Instead of chasing closure from people committed to misunderstanding you, you allow distance to create its own clarity. This transformation is deeply unsettling to anyone who previously depended on your reactions to maintain control. Many people do not realize how much power in relationships and conflicts depends on three things: your reactions, your access, and your emotional attachment. If someone can trigger your emotions, they can influence your behavior. If they have constant access to you, they can repeatedly test your boundaries. And if you remain emotionally attached to their approval, they can use that attachment to manipulate your decisions. These three elements create the foundation of their influence. But when those elements begin disappearing, the dynamic changes completely. When your reactions become calm instead of explosive, their triggers stop working. When your access becomes limited, their opportunities to provoke you disappear. When your attachment fades and you no longer seek their validation, their emotional leverage collapses. This is the moment when the person who once believed they had control begins experiencing panic. The strategies that once worked repeatedly suddenly fail. They attempt the same moves, expecting the same results, but the pattern breaks. For chosen ones, this shift rarely happens overnight. It develops through healing, discipline, and spiritual growth. God often allows people to pass through seasons of difficulty, specifically so they can learn how to stabilize themselves emotionally and spiritually. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to strengthen self-control. Each conflict becomes a lesson about boundaries. Each moment of misunderstanding becomes a chance to detach from the need for approval. Over time, these lessons create a form of quiet strength that cannot easily be manipulated. The person who once reacted impulsively becomes someone who responds with intention. The person who once explained themselves endlessly becomes someone who allows silence to speak. The person who once tolerated disrespect becomes someone who enforces consequences calmly and consistently. When these changes accumulate, the environment around you begins adjusting in response. People who once pushed your limits notice that the limits no longer move. The old arguments lose their power because you are no longer participating in them. The emotional hooks that once kept you engaged simply fall away. That is the moment when the enemy begins recognizing the truth. They can no longer reach you the way they once did. But this turning point does not happen by accident. It is created through specific changes in how you live, how you heal, and how you protect your energy. And understanding those changes reveals exactly what makes someone truly untouchable in the first place. Once the turning point begins appearing in your life, the next question becomes clear. What actually creates the condition where someone becomes untouchable? It is not luck, and it is not simply personality. It is the result of three specific changes that develop over time: healing, boundaries, and privacy. When these three elements begin working together, the dynamics that once allowed manipulation or control start collapsing. The first element is healing. Many conflicts and emotional triggers only exist because old wounds remain active beneath the surface. When someone carries unresolved hurt, rejection, or insecurity, certain words or behaviors can easily activate those emotional buttons. A single comment can reopen an old memory. A subtle insult can trigger the need to defend yourself. Manipulative people often rely on these reactions because they understand that pain creates predictable responses. But healing removes those predictable responses. When someone begins working through their past experiences, their emotional system slowly stabilizes. The memories that once caused immediate reaction lose their intensity. Instead of responding from trauma, the person begins responding from awareness. This is why healing is such a powerful defense. When someone tries to provoke a reaction that used to work, they discover the button no longer exists. The emotional hook they expected to use simply fails. They cannot trigger what you healed.
Ina also removes another powerful form of manipulation, the need for closure from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Many chosen ones once spent enormous energy trying to explain themselves to individuals who had already decided what story they wanted to believe. They hoped that if they found the right words, the misunderstanding would finally disappear. But healing teaches a difficult truth. Some people are not confused. They are committed to distortion because it protects the narrative they prefer. Once you understand that reality, you stop chasing explanations from people who are invested in misunderstanding you. That emotional detachment removes another layer of control they once had over your attention. The second element that creates untouchability is boundaries. Healing changes your internal response, but boundaries change the structure of your interactions. Many conflicts continue repeating simply because the same level of access remains available. When someone can reach you anytime, argue with you anytime, or test your patience repeatedly without consequences, they will often continue doing exactly that. Access becomes the battlefield where manipulation operates. Boundaries change the battlefield entirely. Instead of constant explanations and emotional negotiations, boundaries introduce consequences. Phone calls become fewer. Conversations become shorter. Repeated disrespect leads to reduced access rather than extended debate. You stop explaining your boundaries repeatedly and begin enforcing them consistently. When someone experiences consequences instead of endless conversation, the dynamic shifts immediately. The opportunities to provoke you become limited because the access required to provoke you no longer exists. This is one of the most uncomfortable adjustments for individuals who relied on your availability in the past. They may feel confused or frustrated because the dynamic they once understood no longer works.
But boundaries are not designed to make other people comfortable. They are designed to protect your stability and your purpose. The third element that strengthens this transformation is privacy. In the past, many chosen ones shared too much information with people who later used that information against them. They spoke openly about their plans, their fears, and their next moves, without realizing that not everyone receiving that information had supportive intentions. Information can easily become strategy for someone looking to interfere with your progress. When people know your next step before it happens, they gain the opportunity to criticize it, discourage it, or sabotage it. Privacy removes that opportunity. When you stop announcing your real-time plans, the environment loses the ability to predict your moves. When you stop explaining every decision to people who have not earned that access, your direction becomes harder to manipulate. No information
means no strategy. This does not mean living in secrecy or refusing to communicate with everyone. It means becoming selective about who receives access to your inner world. Trusted individuals who demonstrate integrity may still share in your journey, but the people who previously misused that access no longer receive the same level of visibility. This quiet protection allows your plans to develop without unnecessary interference. When healing stabilizes your emotions, boundaries limit access, and privacy protects your information, the structure of manipulation collapses completely. The person who once depended on your reactions, your availability, and your transparency suddenly loses all three advantages. And when that happens, their behavior begins changing in ways that reveal exactly how much influence they believed they had before.
When healing removes your emotional triggers, boundaries reduce access, and privacy limits the information people can use against you. Something very noticeable begins to happen in the behavior of those who once tried to control you. They begin reacting differently. The dynamic that once felt predictable suddenly shifts into unfamiliar territory. For chosen ones, this stage often reveals the clearest evidence that someone has realized their influence over you is gone. And the signs usually appear in patterns that follow a recognizable sequence. The first sign is escalation. When someone loses the ability to provoke your usual reaction, they often respond by increasing the intensity of their attempts. The comments become sharper, the pressure becomes stronger, the tone becomes more aggressive or more urgent. This escalation happens because the old key that once unlocked your reaction has stopped working. In their mind, the tactic itself is still valid. They simply believe they need to push harder in order to produce the same response they once received. What might have started as subtle sarcasm may become direct criticism. A casual joke that once crossed the line into disrespect may turn into open confrontation. They may attempt to provoke arguments in public settings where emotional reactions would attract attention. Each attempt is designed to test whether your calm is temporary or permanent. But when your composure remains steady, the escalation reveals something important. The tactic itself was never about communication. It was about control. And escalation becomes the evidence that the previous control is no longer working. The second sign often appears once escalation fails to restore the old dynamic. Instead of provoking your reaction directly, they begin shifting the conflict into narrative warfare. If they cannot reach your emotions, they attempt to reach your reputation. Rumors may begin appearing in conversations you are not part of. People may approach you with questions that sound like concern, but are clearly based on stories they heard elsewhere. The person who once tried to provoke you directly now tries to influence how others perceive you. This tactic is often subtle. Instead of openly attacking your character, they may present themselves as worried about your behavior or confused about your decisions. The tone may sound sympathetic while quietly planting doubt in the minds of others. They may triangulate the situation by involving third parties who were never directly part of the conflict. In these moments, it becomes clear that the target of their strategy has changed. When they could reach your emotions, they tried to control you directly. Now that your emotional stability is stronger, they attempt to control the narrative surrounding you. They attack your name because they cannot reach your spirit. But the third sign often reveals the most about their intentions. After escalation and narrative warfare fail to produce the reaction they hoped for, some individuals attempt an entirely different approach. They begin appealing to your empathy. Suddenly, the tone becomes softer. They may present themselves as hurt or misunderstood. Statements that suggest you are causing them pain may appear in conversations. They may remind you of past favors or shared history, hoping to activate your compassion and reopen emotional access. Guilt traps often appear during this stage. The conversation shifts away from their behavior and toward your responsibility to repair the relationship. The goal is not necessarily reconciliation. The goal is emotional access. If they can reopen that connection, the old dynamic may begin functioning again. This tactic can be particularly confusing because it appears gentle rather than aggressive, but the intention remains the same: regain influence over your emotional decisions. The fourth sign appears when even emotional appeals fail to restore the previous dynamic.
In some situations, the person who once provoked conflict may suddenly become unusually friendly. Compliments appear where criticism once existed. Apologies may surface without much depth or reflection. Conversations may include nostalgic references to better moments from the past. This sudden warmth can feel surprising, especially when it contrasts so strongly with previous behavior. But in many cases, the goal is still proximity. When confrontation and pressure fail to reopen the dynamic, friendliness becomes the next strategy to regain access to your life. If proximity returns, the possibility of influence returns with it. Each of these behavioral shifts reveals the same underlying truth. The person involved has realized something fundamental about the situation has changed. The emotional reactions they once depended on are no longer available. The access they once relied on is now limited. The information they once used to anticipate your decisions is no longer accessible. As a result, they begin experimenting with different tactics to regain the position they once held. For chosen ones, recognizing these signs is important, not because it invites retaliation, but because it confirms the transformation that has taken place. The dynamic has shifted. The influence they once believed they had no longer exists in the same way. But recognizing the shift is only part of the process. Maintaining that position requires continuing the habits that created it in the first place. And learning how to protect that stability becomes the final step in remaining truly untouchable. Once the shift has happened, and people around you begin realizing their old tactics no longer work, the next challenge is not proving that you are untouchable. The real challenge is staying that way. Many chosen ones reach this turning point only to lose their stability later because they step back into the same environments, arguments, and emotional patterns that once weakened them. Because becoming untouchable is not a single moment of strength. It is a structure of habits that protect your clarity and your peace. The first principle of maintaining that structure is refusing to step back into arenas designed for conflict. Some people spend enormous energy trying to pull you into public debates, emotional confrontations, or indirect exchanges that happen through social media, group chats, or shared environments. These arenas are rarely about solving problems. They are about spectacle. The person provoking the conflict often benefits from attention, chaos, or the opportunity to present themselves as the victim once the situation escalates. When you refuse to participate in those arenas, the conflict loses its stage. No public arguments mean no dramatic narrative to display. No indirect posts mean no emotional performance for observers. No attempts to defend yourself to committed critics mean the cycle of endless explanations simply ends. Silence in these moments is not avoidance. It is strategy. By refusing the arena, you remove the conditions that make manipulation effective. The second discipline that protects your untouchable position is keeping your character clean. When people lose the ability to provoke you directly, many of them begin waiting for a mistake they can use against you. They watch your behavior carefully, hoping you will eventually react emotionally, speak carelessly, or contradict the calm image you have been maintaining. If that moment happens, they can use it as evidence that their previous accusations were correct. This is why consistency becomes your strongest defense. When your behavior remains steady over time, the stories people attempt to spread lose credibility. Character becomes a form of protection. Integrity creates a barrier that false narratives struggle to cross. You do not need to chase every rumor or correct every misunderstanding. Your consistent actions gradually speak louder than the claims being made about you. Over time, people who observe the situation closely begin noticing the difference between accusation and reality.
But maintaining clean character requires discipline. It means resisting the temptation to retaliate, even when you feel justified. It means avoiding sarcasm, indirect criticism, or emotional outbursts that might feel satisfying in the moment, but damage your long-term credibility. Integrity is not always the fastest path to victory, but it is the most stable one. The third element of remaining untouchable involves tightening access even further. When someone proves they cannot respect your boundaries, the natural response is not to give them another opportunity to test those limits. Instead, you reduce the number of situations where those tests can occur at all. Your circle becomes smaller, but more trustworthy. Conversations become more intentional. Personal information is shared only with individuals who have demonstrated that they can handle it responsibly. Announcements about your plans are often delayed until the work itself is already moving forward. This selective access protects your direction from unnecessary interference. When fewer people know your next step, fewer people can attempt to influence it prematurely. Many chosen ones discover that their peace increases dramatically once they stop sharing their inner world with individuals who previously used that information as leverage. The final discipline that protects your untouchable position is replacing emotional reaction with procedure. Instead of responding to situations impulsively, you develop clear patterns for how you handle conflict and communication. When disrespect appears, the response follows a predictable structure rather than an emotional impulse. There is a pause before any reply. Only the factual part of the situation is addressed, rather than the tone or insult surrounding it. Boundaries are stated clearly and briefly, without extended debate. And if the boundary is ignored, consequences follow immediately rather than after repeated warnings. This procedural approach removes drama from the interaction. Instead of emotional escalation, the situation moves through a simple sequence of response and consequence. People quickly learn that testing your boundaries produces predictable outcomes rather than emotional reactions. In professional or legal environments, procedure becomes even more important. Documentation replaces verbal disputes. Written communication replaces impulsive conversations. Appropriate authorities or formal channels handle issues that once might have become personal arguments. This structure protects both your reputation and your peace by moving the conflict into systems designed to manage it fairly. As these habits become consistent, something remarkable happens. The same people who once believed they could provoke you easily begin recognizing that the environment around you has changed completely. Access is limited, reactions are controlled, information is protected, character remains steady. The system they once relied on simply no longer exists. And when that realization finally settles in, the final truth becomes clear. The untouchable life is not something you announce to the world. It is something you quietly build through discipline, alignment, and the protection God places over a life that refuses to negotiate its integrity. When someone finally reaches the point where manipulation no longer works, reactions are no longer predictable, and access is no longer easily granted, the change can feel almost surreal. The conflicts that once consumed your attention begin fading into the background. The same people who once tried to provoke arguments, pressure your decisions, or challenge your boundaries slowly realize they no longer have the same influence over your life.
But the most important truth about this transformation is that it was never meant to be displayed as a victory over others. The untouchable life is not something you announce. It is something you quietly build through discipline, character, and alignment with the direction God is guiding you toward. Many people misunderstand what it means to become untouchable. They imagine it as a kind of dominance over their enemies, a moment where those who once opposed them finally admit defeat. But that perspective keeps your focus trapped inside the same conflict that once drained your energy. True untouchability has nothing to do with defeating another person. It has everything to do with removing the conditions that allowed that person to control your peace in the first place. The real turning point happens when you stop needing validation from those who once tried to withhold it.
When someone no longer requires approval from the very people who used approval as leverage, the entire power structure of the relationship collapses. The opinions that once felt heavy suddenly lose their weight. The criticism that once provoked long explanations becomes background noise rather than emotional pressure. This is the moment when many chosen ones recognize that freedom does not come from convincing others to respect you. Freedom comes from realizing that your worth was never dependent on their approval to begin with. Another essential shift happens when access becomes intentional rather than automatic. In the past, many conflicts repeated themselves simply because the same individuals had unlimited access to your time, your attention, and your emotions. Every conversation became another opportunity for testing your boundaries. Every interaction became another chance to provoke a reaction. But when access becomes selective, the environment changes immediately. The people who once depended on constant contact lose the ability to repeat the same patterns. The absence of access removes the stage where manipulation once operated. This does not require anger or dramatic confrontation. Often it happens quietly, through distance, shorter interactions, or simply choosing not to participate in the same environments anymore. Over time, the space that once held constant conflict begins filling with something far more valuable: peace. That peace allows your energy to move toward building rather than defending. Instead of spending your attention reacting to other people's tactics, you invest that attention in strengthening your purpose, your discipline, and the direction God is placing in front of you. As this shift continues, another truth becomes increasingly clear. Protection increases where integrity increases. Many people ask God for protection while continuing to expose themselves to the same patterns that weaken them. They remain in environments where disrespect is normalized. They share personal information with people who misuse it. They respond emotionally to every provocation, unintentionally giving their opponents the exact reactions they are hoping to see. But when integrity begins guiding your decisions, protection begins appearing naturally around your life. Integrity changes the environments you enter. It changes the conversations you participate in. It changes the level of access you allow others to have. These adjustments may appear small individually, but together they create a structure that shields your peace and your direction. God does not protect what you continually expose to unnecessary harm. But when you stop negotiating your boundaries and stop explaining your worth to those committed to misunderstanding it, something powerful happens. Your life begins aligning with a higher standard of clarity and purpose. In that alignment, protection becomes more visible. Situations that once would have turned into arguments dissolve quickly. People who once attempted to manipulate you realize the same tactics no longer produce results. And gradually, the environment around you reorganizes itself around the calm stability you have built internally. This does not mean opposition disappears completely. There will always be individuals who misunderstand your boundaries or feel uncomfortable with the independence you now carry. But the difference is that their reactions no longer control your direction. You are no longer responding from fear, guilt, or the need to prove yourself. You are responding from alignment. That alignment changes how you move through every environment you enter. Instead of chasing approval, you protect your peace. Instead of reacting impulsively, you follow clear principles that guide your responses. Instead of exposing every part of your life to public commentary, you allow certain parts of your journey to remain private, between you and God. The result is a life that feels steadier, quieter, and far more focused than the one you lived before. And from that place of clarity, a new declaration becomes possible. I do not argue with darkness. I move in peace and policy. My life is protected and aligned. If this message reflects the season you are entering now, take a moment to recognize the strength it took to reach this point. Comment "Untouchable" if you have stepped into a phase of calm power where your peace is no longer negotiable. And if you want more Chosen One messages on discernment, boundaries, and elevation, subscribe so you can continue strengthening the habits that transform quiet discipline into a life that cannot easily be shaken.